to the floor Matt Watson, who will speak against the motion.
Firstly, thank you very much, Hugh, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to so many bright young things, and the grown-ups as well. I would describe myself as a recovering geoengineer. I have been doing some thinking about geoengineering. It's proved actually rather difficult. I'm going to probably speak a little bit more to Peter than I am to Ollie, not least because I read a recent survey that said there's sort of 82% trust in environmental scientists and 14% trust in journalists. So I'm sort of expecting you to buy into people a little more knowledge. Sorry, we didn't promise no ad hominem attack, but I couldn't resist that one. So I know I'm dead meat later. I've recently read a book by Mike Hume, which actually poses 3 arguments against geoengineering. But before I start discussing those 3, I'd like to make a slightly subtle distinction between CDR and SRM. So a lot of what people describe as CDR, I don't think should be called geoengineering. So if you are replanting trees, or if you're doing this thing called BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, I don't think that's geoengineering, I think that's actually prudence. In terms of CDR, the only technique that I would think of as geoengineering in a classical sense is ocean fertilization. So when I'm talking about geoengineering, I'm talking about large planetary scale manipulations, and those, quite frankly, are terrifying. Mike Hume goes on to pose 3 arguments, and I'll go through them in detail. The first is that the science is unreliable, the second is that the process is ungovernable, and the third is that it's undesirable. I'm going to do my opposition of favour and take out 2 of those arguments immediately because they're clearly nonsense. Mike Hume has a quite significant go at scientists described as hubristic and arrogant. There's very few people around the table who think geoengineering is exciting or safe. It really is perceived to be by absolutely everybody as a desperate last resort. I think the danger about saying something's undesirable is that he falls into a trap that a lot of people that are talking against geoengineering fall into, which is a lack of an adequate counterfactual. What I mean by that is he says something along the lines of, well, actually the planet's not too bad at the moment, why do we need to do this? That's not what he says explicitly, but that's what the subtext of his discussion is. That's a really stupid idea. If you want a very good idea about how geoengineering will work, compare it to what the planet looks like in 50 years' time, not today. However, the one argument that he actually got right, but completely underplayed, is the unreliability. And this speaks to risk and uncertainty in the climate system. I'm going to make 2 arguments. One of them is going to be quite positive. In fact, I'm going to leave the majority of that argument up to Helena. And that is that we know what the right answer is, right? And it's not geoengineering. It's not CDR, and it's certainly not SRM. The right answer is to live sustainably, have a low carbon energy system, and behave ourselves and have some profound respect for the environment. Helena's going to speak to this in more detail, but it's actually perfectly simple. That's the right thing to do. There's no question about it whatsoever. Given that we're absolutely stupid and can't do that, let me make 2 further points about risk and uncertainty. The first is that the system is far too complex to be predictable. Our climate models don't do particularly good at predicting all of the things we need to worry about in terms of climate change, such as rainfall, sea ice. Everything that we need to know about is poorly captured in climate models. There's a lot of, and I apologise to the climate models in the room, but I do passionately agree with this. There's a lot of genealogy in these models, which means they are actually rather similar, which means actually the uncertainty space that these models explore is rather narrow, artificially narrow. That doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it means that they are uncertain. That's an argument, you could say, for not doing geoengineering now. Okay? That's not the motion. The motion is not to think about geoengineering ever. Okay? The problem with thinking about geoengineering is it's quite likely, highly likely, some people believe, to lead to the point we're appallingly bad as a species at developing technologies we then don't use. If anybody can think of a large-scale technology that we've deployed and then kept in our pockets, you're a better person than I am. there is an artificial distinction between deployment and research. Okay, people say just do research and then we'll think about deployment later. That's a fallacy of an argument, because there is no bright line between the two. If you want to know how this stuff really works on a global scale, you would have to do it on a global scale. And even David Keith's idea about ramping up until you see things start to go pear-shaped is a very dangerous idea, because that is not deployment, that is experimentation on the planet. There's the question of who has control and the likelihood of geopolitical conflict. These are underplayed worries about going down the route of geoengineering. And the problem with thinking about geoengineering now is that actually the downstream consequences are very uncertain. But there's a very clear, slippery slope towards actually getting to the point where we can justify this. And it is absolutely terrifying as a prospect. I raised the point of some research done under the SPICE project, which shows that if you cool the top half of the planet, the northern hemisphere, you end up protecting sea ice, which, don't get me wrong, is a good idea and a noble thing to attempt. Unfortunately, what then subsequently happens is you turn off rainfall in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? There are teleconnections we don't understand and can't model. That means that this stuff is so uncertain that the risks of doing it vastly outweigh any potential benefits. Unfortunately, attempting geoengineering is likely to engender and strengthen the status quo. I'll give you a slightly odd analogy here, which is my car is due for an MOT. And about you, I've got a reasonably new car, but not very new, otherwise it wouldn't need an MOT, but I'm being hounded and spammed by the people that sold me the car that I need for an MOT. I've had 4 texts and 5 emails in 7 days, but it's not due until next Friday. I will have it done either next Thursday or Friday, right? We are not particularly good as a species, you could argue it's just me, at doing things preemptively and sensibly. We tend to leave things to the last minute. And the terrifying thing about this is if we deploy it badly, it will, I guarantee, be worse than where we're going into climate change. And that is an incredible thing to say. I don't believe people will act if there is an alternative. I'm not suggesting in any way that this alternative is easy, because it isn't. And anybody that says that geoengineering is a cheap and easy out, I don't believe at all. I don't believe it even looks cheap and easy or politically sensible. But I guarantee you the risks are so large at the moment, we have not a cat and mouse chance of doing it properly. And every time we intervene, even in small scale systems, I'll give you an example of mongoose on Hawaii, where they were introduced to kill the rat population that was artificially introduced by sailors in the 15th century, which then decimated the local bird population because they couldn't be bothered to chase the rats around the island as opposed to the nesting birds. Every time we intervene in the system, something goes wrong because it's more complicated than we understand. Unfortunately, this entire issue, as Tim Kruger wrote in a recent report in Nature, is an issue about virtue. Okay? It's how we treat and respect the planet. And unfortunately, geoengineering is an extension of thinking of the planet as a system that can be fixed technologically, and it can't. We simply need to change our behavior.
So we have 2 questions now from...
Matt, I thought that was fascinating. It struck me that everything you say about why geoengineering is bad, you can just change the word geoengineering to climate change. And in doing so, it seems to me your argument is about shutting down people's room for discussion. You say people will only act in the way that you have decided is correct if they're not allowed to think about the alternatives, and thus we should stop them from thinking about the alternatives. That seems to me a difficult argument to put a good face on.
It is an argument, but it's an argument that I stand by. I mean, I think we're going to be in such serious trouble that actually any sort of societal norms might actually go out the window. And although this is not an endorsement of this action in general, I would make the observation that the most totalitarian regimes, particularly places like China, have the authority to plant billions of trees, which is what they've been doing. And I think it might get to the point where it's actually that serious. And I know that's a horrible thing to say, but actually I also can't imagine democracy flourishing under a geoengineering regime either.
You said rightly that in the long run we have to live sustainably and respect the planet. But the problem, which you in fact identified, is that in 1992 there was the first assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which predicted or showed that the rate of warming was such as to lead to fairly disastrous consequences, which have all come about because the rate of warming has kept up with that or exceeded it. And we knew then that if we want to live sustainably, to live sustainably is the way not to have massive amounts of global warming. But in 25 years, we've done absolutely nothing. As you say, the human race doesn't want to do anything unless it's absolutely forced to, and climate change has been slow enough, or just slow enough, that they haven't had to do anything. You haven't had to stop driving your SUV because you can't get any petrol for it. So, I mean, would you feel that in an ideal world, even an ideal world with 7 billion people that's got to be fed industrially, we could live sustainably? Do you think that we can, because it is a moral issue, because we failed utterly so far, even despite knowing what the consequences would be of not living sustainably?
So I'm going to answer that question quickly in 3 parts. Firstly, I just think we have to try harder, a lot harder. Secondly, yes, I do think we can all live sustainably, but that's going to require massive societal change, which you will argue rightly is not going to be quick. And I think that's a fair and legitimate argument. I think the counterpoint to your point, however, is that if we can't get the right answer right, i.e. we know we need to be living sustainably and we know we need to worry about climate change, I don't see us as having a snowflake in hell's chance of actually then administering the wrong answer in any better way.
Some questions from the floor. There's one up back there. Microphone here. Looks like you. Okay.
Thank you. I have probably 2 quick points to make. One is, I think there's a problem between scientists and journalists. Journalists don't understand facts, and they insist on reporting 2 sides of the story. The second point is, there's a problem in the way we do economics. Economic models last for 20 years at the maximum, 30 years at the maximum. Climate models last a lot longer, unless we factor into account the cost of dumping CO2 and using the environment. None of this will ever be sustainable.
I agree with you about, partially about economics. So certainly economic timescales for models are on the order of a few decades. Political timescales are even shorter, of course. It's very difficult to get a politician to think about what's going to happen in 50 years' time. It's a long way outside their tenure. And as Peter absolutely correctly points out, the carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere now will be around in hundreds of years' time. I do agree that economics has to play a role, but actually economics can be rather cold and rather insensitive. And what I worry about is there's a lot of other value that you can attach to the environment that's not solely economic. So when people start talking about ecosystem services and valuing nature, I see that as a very important tool, but I think it has, from a personal perspective, it has to be only part of the argument. I don't think this can be decided purely on economics. And I think the worry is that if you did that, you'd end up concluding that SRM was the way to go, because it is orders of magnitude cheaper than living sustainably. It simply isn't.
Mike, you said one remarkably precise thing. You said the effect of deploying geoengineering would undoubtedly be worse than the effect of climate change. How do you know? What are the reasons that you believe that?
Well, I guess I'm going to be slightly disingenuous here. It's a very good point, and the truth is I don't know, so I'm going to waffle a little bit. I think the honest truth is you could not tell. Okay, so if we decided to geoengineer 10 years ago, just prior to the devastating floods in Pakistan, that event, because it was something like a 1 in 1,000 year flood, would have been attributed to the start of geoengineering. So you have a problem of unknowability, and you also have a problem of, and there was a very good paper done by Damon Matthews in 2009, who drew these analogues between bio-intervention on a small scale and geoengineering. And what he pointed out is that pretty much any time we try to engineer a system, even a simple system, there are unknown unknowns. So I'll take my precision back slightly, because you're exactly correct as it turns out. This is the problem with doing things on the hoof. And I'll reclassify my statement as you wouldn't be able to tell. But actually there is a significant risk of getting it worse. There's a significant risk of the cure being worse than the disease.
Hi, so this is somewhat related to something that Mr. Morton said earlier. Do you think that geoengineering and changing the way we live are mutually exclusive? Do you think that if we start geoengineering, we'll lose the will to try to live more sustainably?
Yes, so this is an argument called the moral hazard, which states that if you make something easy, then people won't change. I think, not to put my social science colleagues on the spot, I think that's a significant risk, but I don't know the magnitude of the risk. It's quite uncertain. So it could be a small effect, it could be a large effect. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that geoengineering, so taking the edge of the temperature of the planet, would encourage people not to change as fast. I think that's quite a likely outcome. I think not least because there are some quite strong arguments about the biosphere that suggest in a geoengineered, hazy, high CO2 world, actually more the biosphere, particularly the artificial parts of the biosphere that we use as crops, might benefit. There are papers, particularly by Ken Caldera's group, that suggest that a high SO2 SRN world might be in some ways more palatable. I think that may be true, but actually it's quite a dangerous argument.
Well, thank you very much, Matt.